Hello, welcome to The Elephant. I'm Kevin Conrad. Well, the long-awaited UN Summit on Climate Change is just around the corner. On November 30th, over 130 leaders from around the world will meet in Paris and try to set the stage for a global agreement on climate change. They'll only be there for a couple of days, but then they'll hand things off to their team of ministers and negotiators. And then, in the course of the next 2 weeks, those negotiators, representing 196 countries, will try to hammer out a deal to get the world on a path to reducing global carbon emissions and keep the planet's temperature increase below at least 2 degrees. And you could be forgiven if you have the sense, wait, haven't we been here before? Because in a sense we have. This meeting in Paris is called COP21. COP stands for, in UN speak, the Conference of the Parties. And the 21 is the number of times that countries have met before in order to try to figure out a way to collectively stop us from heading down this path of climate meltdown. It's a process that started way back in 1992 with the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. But while the whole process is an old one, up until now results have been mixed. Or mixed might be a bit generous. The world's emissions have risen steadily since these UN summits began, and the only time that the world agreed to a binding treaty to limit emissions, with the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, it soon fell apart. Along the way, there have been major disagreements between rich countries and poor countries about just who should cut their emissions, by how much, and who should pay for the consequences. While these UN summits on climate change take place each year, Copenhagen in 2009 was the last time that leaders around the world came together to try to strike a formal treaty to reduce global emissions. That effort largely ended in failure and breakdown, with only an informal agreement coming out of it called the Copenhagen Accord. It was an understanding that President Obama spearheaded between the US, China, South Africa, India, and Brazil, but which the rest of the world was left out of and could only acknowledge after the fact. A key difference this time with the process in Paris is that countries are taking a bottom-up approach. Instead of trying to lay down an emissions reduction target from above that countries will have to meet, this time the vast majority of countries have submitted plans in advance of Paris, outlining what their national targets will be for how much they're going to decrease their emissions. These are called INDCs. They're voluntary, and it's been left to each country to decide what exactly they're going to pledge. For example, the US has announced it will cut its emissions by 26% compared with 2005 levels, while China has agreed that its emissions will peak by 2030. But even if every single country actually meets its voluntary target that it's put forward, we're still heading towards at least 2.7 degrees of warming. And remember, over 2 degrees is considered dangerous by most scientists. To us outsiders, this UN process can all seem opaque and complex. So over the next 3 days, we'll be bringing you the perspective of 3 different negotiators who have lived and breathed these talks. They'll give us a sense of what it's like to actually be in these negotiation rooms, and what we should understand about what will be taking place in Paris. First up in the series is Kevin Conrad. While he's now based in America, Kevin Conrad grew up in Papua New Guinea, and he represented that country at climate talks for about 8 years. He's also the director of a party group at these talks called the Coalition for Rainforest Nations. This year he's on Panama's delegation. So Kevin Conrad has seen these negotiations inside and out, and he actually gained prominence during a critical moment at these UN talks in 2007, when there was an impasse at the COP negotiations in Bali caused by the US. He was representing Papua New Guinea and spoke out. Here's a clip from CNN at the time.
You know, the formulation that has been put forward, we cannot accept.
Thank you. Thank you, United States.
The US was booed as it asked for more commitments from developing countries, provoking this from Papua New Guinea.
And there's an old saying, if you're not willing to lead, then get out of the way. And I would ask the United States, we ask for your leadership. We seek your leadership. But if for some reason you're not willing to lead, leave it to the rest of us. Please get out of the way.
And then this total change from the United States.
That we will go forward and join consensus in this today.
I reached Kevin Conrad by phone. Well, Kevin Conrad, welcome to The Elephant. So basically, for our listeners, we're trying to get sort of a layman's guide to understanding what goes on at these UN climate conferences as we head into Paris. And so you represented for many years Papua New Guinea at these talks, right?
Correct.
So can you tell me a bit about what's actually going to be happening in Paris for someone who has never been to these talks? How would you explain it? What is the goal?
The goal is to get as many countries representing as much as possible of the total carbon that is emitted in the atmosphere annually to agree on bottom-up plans that reduce emissions at the same time. And so the question is, can we still develop at the same rate or close to it in ways that don't poison our atmosphere? And that's disconnecting from fossil fuels in summary, or figuring out how to burn fossil fuels in a manner that doesn't put them up in the atmosphere the next 1,000 years.
And so that's what world leaders are going to be trying to do, is to figure out a way to collectively do that?
Exactly. I guess we'll get into this in more detail going forward, but the big debate is about sort of who caused this problem, and as we think about solutions, whose responsibility is it to implement, and should, particularly for poor countries, should their transition be funded by the rich countries, which in many cases have put the most carbon up in the atmosphere. So leaders are trying to say, how do we solve this problem, and how do we solve it in an equitable manner that allows the poor to continue to develop and allows the rich to sort of transition to a more sustainable energy regime primarily.
So I think those of us who have, had at least a moderate interest in climate change, or a concern about climate change, but haven't followed it super closely, the whole thing has a bit of a sense of deja vu. Like, there was Copenhagen, where we were told that this is like the make or break deal, and it all counts on this, and then nothing seemed to really happen, and now we're back at the same spot 6 years later. Is there anything different about this time? Like, it seems like we've been over and over and over this again. It's called COP21, which means there's been 20 previous meetings. Is there any reason we should feel any differently about this one?
Well, if you think back about the history, in 1992 in Rio was when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was agreed. And in fact, the whole world agreed to that convention and ratified it. In fact, including President George Bush the first. The United States ratified that as well. And what was powerful about that was that you had the entire world agreeing that we had a challenge before us. And in 1992, a lot of the people didn't understand exactly how that challenge would impact them. As time advanced, and in 1997, or 5 years later, the Kyoto Protocol was implemented. And what the Kyoto Protocol basically did, it was top-down. It said, we realize we have a problem. We understand what needs to be done to solve it. Let's have everyone agree to take, in effect, top-down targets that add up to where we need to go and implement them domestically. But that proved difficult. So countries like Canada pulled out very quickly, Japan has pulled out, and the U.S., though they endorsed it at the meeting, it was never ratified by the Senate, and it quickly sort of unraveled what I call sort of a top-down mentality. In Copenhagen, there's value. I mean, in fact, Paris is operating on the ashes of Copenhagen. It created the fertilization that was necessary for what we hope to achieve in Paris. And in Copenhagen, the idea was that it would be bottom up, that rather than an international body, in effect, telling countries what they had to do, that countries should be looking at their own national circumstances or what's going on in their country and sort of voluntarily produce plans saying, how is it we're going to contribute. In effect, what President Obama has done, he's looked at in the United States, he's looked at the U.S. economy. He's tried to, through executive order, implement different initiatives. It's the same thing that China has done, and it is in effect what 170 countries have done leading up to Paris, which is to create these national plans.
These are the so-called INDCs?
These are the INDCs. But what failed in Copenhagen was, I've listened to other prognosticators, and I think it was Kevin Rudd, I can't remember if it was on your program or somewhere else, his view was, well, we had all the leaders around the table, and China and India sent ministers, and they weren't serious, and it's because they weren't serious that Copenhagen failed. I disagree with that. What failed in Copenhagen was a philosophy that all countries must be the same, and that in order to solve this problem, there can be no difference between the China and U.S. per se. That that China and the U.S. have to progress in lockstep, as it were, or simplistically, in order for a deal to work. And at that time, China and India were saying, guys, what you're putting forward is not historically correct. It's not correct from a development standpoint, and we don't want to be party to an agreement that is going to fail because it's based on the fundamentals that are incorrect or a wrong worldview.
And what was the wrong worldview in that case?
Well, the wrong worldview was that all countries, when it comes to climate change, are effectively the same or need to be the same very quickly. And it ignores that, a country like China with a GDP of $3,000 per person versus the United States of $45,000 per person, you can't expect the people in China to respond as effectively as the United States or in Europe. So, yes, we have to solve this collectively. There are different responsibilities for different countries based on their historical emissions, their current emissions, and their comparative wealth. And we need an agreement that is inclusive and deals with that reality. And that's where Copenhagen got it a bit wrong and failed. The question is whether in Paris we can get that balance right, and that's our challenge.
So you mentioned ideally there would be a different approach. So is that what you mean in terms of so each country, or 170 or more now, have given their own personal plans of how they will go about reducing their emissions? So do you see that as an improvement over one goal binding treaty?
Well, I don't. The problem is that's the reality. When you're dealing with a global problem and you need a global solution, and that solution is very clear from the metrics in terms of what needs to happen, it would be much better for reasonable people to get around a table and fairly apportion responsibilities to each other and then hold each other accountable to achieve that goal. The problem we have is that the Kyoto Protocol, which tried to do that, has failed, and people have walked away from it because they say, that they needed more people around that table. What we have now is a bottom-up effort. And, on one hand, it's great. I think I was reading the latest data. We have 170 countries engaging, and that accounts for 93% of global emissions. And the idea is that they all voluntarily propose what they're going to do, and then maybe, because we haven't agreed on this yet, maybe every 5 years we come back and have a gut check. Are we on track? Are we getting where we need to go? But even that's not agreed yet in Paris. So it's when you ask, is this better? It's like herding cats. It's going to be much more challenging, and we're still not certain whether we have a sufficiently robust agreement that is going to have an accountability clause or metric placed in there where at least we're coming back periodically and saying, are we anywhere close to where we need to be? Now, that's important from the following perspective. If you look at the collective carbon emissions that are pledged through these INDCs, it's only an 8% reduction. And if you look at the science, we need to be at a 20 to 40% reduction based on the trajectory. So everyone has pledged, but and yes, it's positive that they've pledged, and yes, it's positive that we have an 8% reduction. That's better than zero, but we're still a long way away from where we need to go. And the question is whether the Paris Agreement will provide that pathway.
8% reduction by when?
That's by 2030.
Okay, and we need to get to what amount?
Well, by 2030, we need to be double or triple that. And the reason I'm hedging is that's another debate that hopefully is going to be solved in Paris. And that's the question is a 2-degree limit sufficient, or should it be 1.5? And where that tension really hits are on small island states. The difference between a 2-degree limit and a 1.5 limit may be the disappearance of the Maldives, for example, or it may be the disappearance of Tuvalu. That the sea level rise that is embedded in what seems to be a small discrepancy of 0.5 degrees has significant, in fact, life-ending consequences on many poor people that live either on coastlines or on low-lying islands. And so, depending on whether you're viewing this from the perspective of the most vulnerable, we have we're talking about an additional 10% that we need to reduce. If you're talking about this as close to business as usual for the rich countries, we're talking 20% reductions, and that needs to be answered in Paris as well, and it has not been yet.
Well, I've heard that it's basically we already have 1.5 degrees locked in, even if we were to stop somehow emitting carbon today. And a lot of people I've been reading are saying that now 2 degrees is virtually impossible, even with all the efforts we can. So how would the debate be between 1.5 and 2? Is that still possible?
Well, that ignores the whole concept of removals. So if you look only at emissions, which are primarily that come from 2 primary sources, that's burning fossil fuel or destroying forests, and you say if we continue sort of burning fossil fuels and cutting forests, there's truth to that statement. What it ignores is tools that we can put in place that remove carbon from the atmosphere. So forests do that naturally. Forests remove or reduce a global average of about 3 tons per acre. So the more forests we have or we keep, and the more forests we grow, the bigger chance we have to get towards 1.5 degrees. The second is there are technologies now that can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. They can put that carbon in a soda can and you can drink it. That's called carbon neutral. It goes back. Or they could take that carbon and turn it into a brick and use it in a construction of a home. And, it may be that the future we seek is going to be pulling that carbon out of the atmosphere, locking it into a brick, and requiring that all new construction is embedding carbon in infrastructure. But you're absolutely right. If we don't remove carbon from the atmosphere, 1.5 degrees is gone, and 2 degrees is a challenge. But we believe that removals are a critical part of the future, and that 2 degrees is achievable with removals, and 1.5 degrees still should be a target, simply because the difference impacts so many poor people so significantly.
I mean, even to 2 degrees, it seems like the scale of the transformation that will need to happen is almost mind-blowing, like on the scale of what we had to do during world wars.
Well, look at what's happening now in Europe. Why are so many people migrating to Europe? And much of what's driving that is the drought in Syria that had 500,000 farms become unviable. And in order to feed themselves, they've had to move. And in that vacuum of poverty and political breakdown, We have ISIS and the rest of those. There are many other groups such as them taking advantage of that. The projections of science is that's going to be scaled up in terms of the impacts. There are going to be more regions that are facing these catastrophic failures, and you're going to have more people migrating. And so in that sense, it is nearly on the scale of a world war. And as you can see the signs today. And that's the point, is that this is a world war that we can avoid if we start getting serious today, and there's no silver bullet here. We have to pursue every strategy for emission reductions and every strategy for removals that are necessary if we want the world as we know it today to continue.
As you said, it's a bottom-up approach this time around, with each country submitting their own plan. So I'm a bit confused about what an actual agreement in that context looks like, given that each country is saying this is what we'll do. What does an agreement look like in that scenario?
Well, the agreement in that scenario has 3 to 4 basic elements. So element number 1 is your national contribution. So what is it that you as a country believe you can do towards the overall objective? The second question that an agreement has to have is, assuming that's not enough, which the current data shows, how regularly can we update our goals or our INDCs? That without a ratcheting up, if we just lock in the current INDCs, the significant impacts due to climate change are certain. So we need that ratcheting up or that periodic review. The third key element is we have to have a strong finance component in here. And I guess from a practical standpoint, if a rich country looks at its emissions and determines that it's very expensive for them to transition, and they can finance an equal amount of emission reductions more cheaply in a developing country, there's nothing wrong with that. That as long as it nets out and overall we're heading on the right trajectory, if emission reductions are fixed and stuck in one location, but emission reductions can be facilitated through intelligent finance elsewhere, we need an agreement that encourages that. Then the fourth key point from my perspective is it needs to be inclusive. That if countries don't see in this agreement a way for them to engage in a way that they can explain to their people back home that this is doable and inclusive for everyone, it's not going to work. We need all countries actively engaged in the process. And that's the fourth key thing that I think we have to deliver in Paris to be successful.
Can you tell me about what the main sort of cleavages or blocks are at these agreements? Should we understand it mainly in terms of rich countries and poor countries? Is it more complicated than that? Because I've heard that people negotiate essentially as groups. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, the UN process, and I guess every human process, ends up in groups of countries that share common interest. So as you look at the UNFCCC or the UN process, you have Europe that tends to share a common experience with another group called the Umbrella Group. And the Umbrella Group is sort of all the other developed countries that are not in Europe. So it's the US, it's Australia, it's Canada, it's Norway, it's a bunch of all those. Then you have the Group of 77, which is a historical sort of manifestation of developing countries. And to be clear, New Zealand was once a G77 member. They've now graduated out and they're part of the Umbrella Group. But the G77 is now I think 140 countries or 144 countries. Now, even in developing countries, there's a lot of differentiation. And so second-tier alliances are necessary. So you have the Association of Small Island States, and they're aligning and saying, hey, guys, we're some of the most vulnerable. If we just have China speak for us, our interests aren't going to be heard. So then you have a second tier in the G77. So you have a coalition, then you have, least developed countries, you have Africa, And they all operate as a second tier amongst the developing countries, and in many cases have very different views. So it becomes complex in the party groupings. Then your second question was about the fault lines. Okay, so now you have all these different groups with similar experience or similar sort of economic status, then operating individually and as part of groups. Well, what is it they disagree on? So some of the fault lines are, as I talked earlier, historical responsibility. Okay, well, if the rich countries are primarily responsible for the problem, what is their obligation in the solution? And there's a lot of debate about that. I've heard the U.S. speak just very recently, well, we've done the math, and actually we don't really have that much historical responsibility, and there are countries that are in the developing world that have more responsibility than us, and there's a big effort to sort of confuse historical responsibility. So the next question is about rich and poor. So you have countries like Singapore or some of the oil states where they say, well, look, you're richer than many of the countries with the historical responsibility. So, let's not just focus on historical responsibility. Let's focus on who has the means. So Singapore, you should be doing more, or Saudi Arabia, or, so you have that rich versus poor fault line. The third fault line you have is what I call the vulnerability factor. What about those countries where inaction ends their history as they know it, that they disappear off the face of the earth? Can they necessarily rely on other countries to be their voice? And so you have those coming out. Then a fourth fault line is the oil producers. So they're saying, hey, we may be in the Middle East, we're not really that wealthy per capita. You're saying that you're no longer going to buy our oil because it's causing these problems. That's going to have a huge impact on our economy. So you need to talk to us about how we're going to transition. So that's called response measures. How do we respond? What measures do we put in place to respond to the weaning off fossil fuels? And those are fault lines. That gets to, well, who pays and how much, and how does the right to develop fit in there? If you're a poor country, what is your right to continue to sort of pull yourselves out of poverty and do it in a way that isn't, impacting the atmosphere? Those are some of the fault lines that we're all trying to manage in Paris. How do you get an agreement that balances all those issues?
That seems quite daunting.
Well, that's why some fail. Some meetings fail, and that's why it's a challenge to be understood from the outside, because you have so many different sort of stakeholder groups pushing so many different agendas and trying to get a common agreement. It's a real challenge.
Yeah, because to imagine, Saudi Arabia trying to understand Tuvalu, whose country might not exist even with 2 degrees of warming, it's hard to imagine how they can see eye to eye.
Exactly right. But they're all in the G77 together, which is why then they create these subgroups. And in many cases, you have another subgroup, which is called the basics, which is now India, China, South Africa, and the wealthy developing countries. So it just continues to fracture and make an outcome more challenging. But having said all of that, it's possible. Complex, but possible.
Can you give me a sense of what it's like to actually be there as a negotiator? So you're there at these meetings all day. Like, what exactly is going on?
Let me explain it sort of 3 or 4 ways. So, number one, it's physically exhausting. Our team typically gets 3 to 4 hours of sleep per day for 2 weeks. And for some people, that's no problem, but for most of us, we operate much better the closer we get to 8. So to be at 3 or 4 and then having to negotiate and think critically and articulate concisely, it's a challenge.
I can imagine it. It sounds like a terrible idea.
Yeah, a
room full of grumpy people.
Exactly, and it happens. They have everyone has their best expectations, and I'll get into. I'll talk to you a little bit right after this about what happens in the rooms. How does it work? And the point is, nobody wants to do that, but the way it's structured, we end up with very time-consuming discussions and negotiations. So you're tired, and not only that, the food is usually horrible, so you don't want to eat. So you're overtired, you're underfed, and with the invention of these latest gadgets, we're actually measuring our steps now during these negotiations. And some guys on my team are walking a marathon every day between rooms, trying to get a hold of everyone in one room and move them to another room. And so here you are with 3 to 4 hours of sleep, not enough calories, and walking a marathon every day. It's a challenge. The second point is, a lot of it is very boring. Okay, for large periods of time, it's very boring because it's a diplomatic cycle. Every country has the right to speak, and not every country is succinct, crisp, articulate, and short. So you get many countries that will talk for literally 20 minutes, and at the end of it, sometimes you're questioning what the point of it was, but diplomatically, you can't stop them, and you have to listen to them. So you spend a large portion of your day listening to things you've heard before and that aren't particularly that relevant, and trying to interject relevance into these discussions. And it can be boring. They're group positions. They're often not innovative. They're slow to evolve. Often they're not well thought out, and a lot of times it's political rhetoric. Now, why would you go through the system where you're exhausted and bored? Why would you bother? And the reason is that these agreements actually do have potential to solve the problem and to change things. And for brief moments in time, there are very concise and meaningful breakthroughs. And so you have to be ready for those. So you're exhausted. A lot of it is boring. For 15 to 20 minutes to 2 hours, there's a really important session that's going on or negotiation where you have to mobilize your teams. And if you're successful there, you can really change the paradigm. But it happens very quickly. It happens at unexpected times. So, words matter because these are treaty documents. You have to be able to understand words. You have to be able to propose words that solve problems. At the same time, optics matter. You have to be able to signal the intent clearly, and often that doesn't happen in these treaties agreements. And you have to balance the legal versus the political tensions on a regular basis. So it's not something I recommend to friends. If this is, you have something you're bored and you have something you want to do, come in and negotiate. But at the same time, I've spent 10 years doing it because I do believe in the process. I do believe this is the only way to turn the ship in the right direction.
I saw a draft agreement, or I was reading about what was coming out of Bonn a few weeks ago as they tried to set the stage for the agreement in Paris. And it was interesting to look at because it's just brackets of potential words that they might have in there. It seems you really have to argue about very specific words and commas and things like that. Is that right?
That's exactly the situation. And that feeds me a little bit into the process. Let me talk about the process quickly and how it's supposed to work to resolve those tensions. So you have two levels of negotiations. One is technical and one is political. So the technical negotiators are people from government departments, and they're bureaucrats, and many of them are great at what they do. But they will then negotiate, and what you saw coming out of Bonn was the work of the technical people, the bureaucrats. And their job is they're given a mandate. So, a country says, hey, we have to have renewables in there. They will go to those negotiations and insert renewables in every relevant clause and in many unrelevant clauses just to make sure it's there. The second process then is the technical people are to whittle that down. So now everyone has put in this agreement every wish list that they possibly have, which is what came out of Bonn. And the first week in Paris will be to whittle that down. Again, the technical people. So, please, ladies and gentlemen, we understand that you threw everything up there that you could possibly want. can you whittle that down and make sure you have exactly in there what you need and nothing more? What happens then is the second process kicks in, and the ministers come in. And the minister's job is to translate this into something politically they can explain to their constituents. And their job is to solve problems that technical people can't solve. And that's the second step of the process. So each decision text goes forward to ministers, and their job is to approve, to send it back to negotiators to say you didn't go far enough, or to say, negotiators, you're never going to solve it, so we're going to meet in a small group and solve it at a political level. The process in Paris, what you need to be watching is how successful are the technical people in shrinking this 50-page text into something closer to 20 to 30, and what issues have they not been able to resolve at the end of Saturday? This is, December 5th, I think. What have they not been able to solve, and how much work are they putting on the ministers? And then the second week will be seeing, well, how much of this unsolved work will the ministers take on themselves, and how much will they send back to the negotiators saying you didn't do enough work, spend another couple days and come back to us? And that's the way the process is going to go all the way to the end of Paris.
And so 130 world leaders are coming too, right, at the start. So how does that work? It would seem that coming at the end would be the most important thing. So what are they doing when they arrive? Are they talking to each other? Are they talking to the negotiators?
Well, the idea is the following, that when we were in Denmark, it was observed that the leaders should be there at the end to actually solve the problems. And what happened was it wasn't possible to get 130 leaders in one room around a table eyeballing each other and trying to solve problems, so they got a subset in a room. And I was in the green room. I was there. I was watching President Obama, Angela Merkel, President Sarkozy, and all these countries in a small room trying to negotiate to solve this. But what happened was, there were more people outside the room than there were in the room, and the whole thing collapsed.
This is when we got the Copenhagen Accord with the informal agreement?
This is when we got the Copenhagen Accord, and there was a small group that approved it. The vast majority did not. There was a major disaster on the floor. No one would accept it, and it never was approved. It ended up as a footnote to another decision because it wasn't inclusive and participatory. So in Paris, what they've said is, look, we don't want to repeat that. So can we have the presidents come at the beginning, give the mandate, dictate what needs to happen to everyone, set the vision for what they want to see occur at the end of the 2 weeks, and then leave. Then let's allow the technical people to have a week and the ministers to have a second week, and hopefully at the end of that we'll have an agreement. But what the French do not want is leaders coming in at the end and having only a small subset of people deciding for the whole world.
So do you think it's a positive step then that the world leaders will be coming at the start?
I'm mixed on it in the following sense, that yes, you need a president or a prime minister to give you directive, but in theory they could do that before you left your capital. There are very difficult issues that may need to be solved at the end, and it would be better if there was an inclusive process at the end to bring whatever level a country wanted to send to agree to a final outcome. But this is a little bit, everyone's still shell-shocked from Copenhagen, and they don't want anything that would look like, walk like, or talk like the Copenhagen outcome, and so they're trying to go with the opposite. I think it will work, and that is part of what what my evaluation of the overarching agreement would be. This is a very different outcome that we're seeking. We're seeking an agreement that allows countries to voluntarily do what it is they want to do. And the difficult issues are just, do we agree to review that periodically, and do we agree that finance should be part of the deal? It's not that hard, candidly. If we can't agree to this, the UNFCCC just needs to pull up its tent and cease to exist. The asks are not that difficult. And I think we have to be able to get it done. And that's what I think that's the calculus of the French too, that if we shouldn't need leaders there. It's not that difficult. And if we do, and if it fails, maybe that's an indictment on the process as a whole.
Can the process be derailed by just one bad actor at all? Like if, say, just one country decides
ask.
Yeah, go ahead.
The answer to that is yes. The way the process works is somewhat counterintuitive, and it's ineffective due primarily to rich countries, and I'll explain. So both the Kyoto Protocol and the UNFCCC allow voting. They say that if you can't agree, you should take a vote. It's just reasonable. But in the rules of procedure, the rich countries have not allowed Rule 42 to be passed, which explains how voting would happen. So you have the optics, which is you can solve something by voting only when consensus isn't reached. But in practice, the rules of procedure never allow you to call for a vote. So we end up where in a definition of consensus, and consensus was traditionally viewed as every single country in the room has to say yes. And if they don't, there's no consensus and there's no agreement. What that facilitated was hostage taking. You were able then to have a special interest and say that we're not going to come to consensus unless our special interest is addressed. And we've seen what special interest power does in political systems around the world. It's not healthy. And it hasn't been healthy to the UNFCCC either. After Bali, we started to think about, well, maybe consensus isn't exactly 100%. Maybe it's pretty close. And there's been some work around that. There have been cases in Cancun, and there have been subsequent cases where there was one party saying no, based on a special interest, and the agreement went through. We have proposed that as this problem grows, we have to be much more proactive about how we make decisions, and that voting needs to be instituted. And yes, consensus is important for inclusion, but when special interest takes over consensus, there has to be a mechanism that allows us to push through that. And so we've been advocating voting for a long time. And, what consensus does in simple terms, you get the lowest ambition. Because if you're talking about how high you're going to shoot, the consensus is always at the lowest target. And if you get the slowest pace. If you talk about how fast we should go, then with consensus, you can only go at what everyone agrees to be the slowest pace. So consensus just doesn't work. It's not the right fit for the challenge that we face. And if you look at the Paris Agreement, voting is in there again, but we really have to get back to the rules of procedure to make that practical.
So it doesn't sound like it's looking that much better then?
The mood is changing. I think Papua New Guinea and Mexico have an amendment into the convention itself to say if consensus isn't reached, any party can ask for a vote. That amendment is on the table. It's a slow process, but I think we're going to get to a point in the very near future where people understand that a vote is close enough that the principle of hostage taking and for special interest is not viable anymore. In that the more you do that, the more likely the vote is. And we've seen a lot more proactive solutions since that time. So I'm still positive. I still think we will come out of Paris with an agreement. The agreement will in no way be good enough, but it should have embedded within it the tools that allow us to improve it over time.
How significant would you say the agreement between America and China that came out last year was? There was a lot of people who said this is a historic agreement, especially since the fact that China was developing so quickly and was under no obligation to limit its emissions was seen as a major stumbling block. Do you think that has played a key role in preparing the lead up to these negotiations?
Well, look, there are two ways to look at that, and it's been a big fight between John Kerry and President Hollande. Right. If that was the U.S. originally said the reason they weren't signing up to the Kyoto Protocol is that China wasn't in it. So now the U.S. and China have agreed So you should be able to go to Paris then and get a legally binding agreement. Well, what does Kerry say? No, we can't have a legally binding agreement because the Senate still won't ratify it. So, it still hasn't changed the paradigm. We're still going to Paris with the exact same weaknesses in the system that we had before that was signed up. So has it materially changed the negotiations and the structure of the future agreement? The answer is no. But was it an important signal? And the important signal, I agree with, that to have China as a leading developing country agree to a voluntary INDC, that it was going to be proactive in support, sent signals to other developing countries, and having developing countries and rich countries all as part of a solution is critical. So it had political symbolism importance, and it did catalyze what I'd call the right momentum. Do I see it as game-changing? Absolutely not.
Just because you still can't get a binding treaty in with America, or?
No, because the agreement we're going to come out of Paris because of the United States is going to be you volunteer to participate and you volunteer to implement the terms of the agreement.
And that essentially all comes down to the fact that it would be impossible to pass anything in the U.S. Senate?
As I understand it. Kerry wrote a piece in the Financial Times saying, "Hey guys, don't lead us back there because we're not going to get it through the Senate." And in fact, it was in the papers today, the Republicans coming out saying, and even the finance guys, don't start cashing those checks yet because not only the emission reductions we're trying to roll back, but the financial commitments we're not going to approve because we're going to approve the budgets. So I guess my question back to you is, has the China agreement changed the dynamic? As far as I can tell, those were the exact same issues we were dealing with last year and 5 years and 10 years.
Right, and it seems scary given that if it's all dependent on executive power, if a Republican wins who denies climate change, then it seems like everything is back to square one.
You run the risk of that, but at the same time, that's reality. So I was having this discussion at lunch, and that is this a perfect agreement? Is it going to be a perfect agreement? Absolutely not. Is the agreement in and of itself going to solve the problem? Very unlikely. But should this agreement provide a platform where once people, and I mean the voters of the world, understand the significance of the problem, they have a pathway and a framework that allows them to prepare plans that are more and more ambitious to succeed? The answer is this agreement should provide that. And is an agreement in Paris better than zero? The answer is definitely. So we have to work for it, and we have to view it not as the answer, but we have to view it as an important step in this journey we have to take our economies to a carbon neutral position.
Well, to end off, I was curious what still gives you hope in this process, given that you've been involved with it for so long, and it sounds quite frustrating. And it goes back to Rio in 1992, and yet global emissions have still continued to rise. So what still gives you faith in the process?
If you look back in human history, every major issue that humanity has faced has taken time. I mean, if you look at the issue of slavery, that wasn't solved in one night or in one day or in one process. You look at piracy, it took decades to solve and to turn the ship around. To have a short and concise answer or response to a very large and complex problem is unrealistic. So I think we have to be in for the long haul. We have to celebrate the steps forward, and we have to work to block against backsliding. And we have to remain committed. That there are issues as humans that we have to stick with, and education and health and dealing with climate change and man-made difficulties in the environment are things we have to stay committed to. And they're multi-generational commitments. And I see climate change as just one of those big picture issues. And I'll do my part, but we have to have the next generation carry forward, and we just have to keep this moving forward.
And I'd just be curious, how do you prepare for these things personally, given that you sleep only 3 to 4 hours a night? Is there anything you do in the week before to prepare yourself?
Yes, it is a physical battle. So I jog more often. I try to oversleep for months in advance. I try to build the reserves. It's no joke. I have not done that in the past, and I've got sick after like the first 4 days and been in bed. You really, really have to prepare physically and mentally to succeed.
Well, let's certainly hope that that happens and that preparation pays off.
I hope so too. And thanks for shining a light on these issues. And please keep doing it, because the more people we have thinking about this, and the higher chance we have to solve it. And not everybody has to suffer like I do through these negotiations. There's so much you can do at home. There's so many things that we can all contribute in small ways, but you add all that up and we've got big changes.
Well, Kevin Conrad, thanks so much for talking to us today and explaining some of the process.
I appreciate it. Keep up the good work.
That was Kevin Conrad, the director of a party group called the Coalition for Rainforest Nations, who represented Papua New Guinea for 8 years at these climate talks, and this year is on the delegation for Panama. Well, that's all for this episode of The Elephant, and we'll be back tomorrow with a conversation with Yeb Sanyo, a former lead negotiator for the Philippines and a leader of the People's Pilgrimage, a march for climate change that's taking place right now from Rome to Paris. The Elephant is made with support of the CKAA, a European society of entrepreneurs, scientists, students, professionals, and policy officers working to create a climate-resilient society. Find out more at ckaa.eu. I'm Kevin Caners. See you tomorrow.